The day I became the most hated man in Hillside Manor was the same day I realized just how much power I had. $1,000 fine for parking my own truck in my driveway. My name's Sam Carter, and I was living what seemed like the American dream. A quiet suburban home, a steady job, and a loving family. But the HOA, led by Cheryl Davis, quickly showed me that nothing here was mine. Not even my driveway. At first it was harmless. Minor fines for my lawn, a small issue with my fence color, but then they crossed a line. I parked my truck in front of my house for a few days while working on some renovations. A harmless inconvenience, right? Then came the letter $1,000 for parking a truck. I was stunned. This wasn't just a fine, it was an assault. I tried reaching Cheryl, but she ignored my calls, brushing me off like I was just another resident to control. But what she didn't know, the clubhouse that everyone adored, it was on my deed. And I wasn't just going to pay that fine, I was going to take control. I wasn't a victim anymore. I had a plan, and it was time to show them exactly who was in charge. The day I became the most hated man in Hillside Manor was the same day I realized just how much power I had. $1,000 fines for parking my own truck in my driveway. My name's Sam Carter, and I was living what seemed like the American dream. A quiet suburban home, a steady job, and a loving family. But the HOA, led by Cheryl Davis, quickly showed me that nothing here was mine, not even my driveway. At first it was harmless, minor fines for my lawn, a small issue with my fence color. But then they crossed the line. I parked my truck in front of my house for a few days while working on some renovations. A harmless inconvenience, right? Then came the letter $1,000 for parking a truck. I was stunned. This wasn't just a fine, it was an assault. I tried reaching Cheryl, but she ignored my calls, brushing me off like I was just another resident to control. But what she didn't know, the clubhouse that everyone adored, it was on my deed. And I wasn't just going to pay that fine, I was going to take control. I wasn't a victim anymore. I had a plan, and it was time to show them exactly who was in charge. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I first met Cheryl Davis, the president of our HOA. I had just finished breakfast with Lisa and the kids when I noticed a car slowing down in front of my house. It wasn't unusual, many of the neighbors drove by, either on their way to work or taking their dogs for a walk. But this car stopped. The driver, a tall woman with an almost regal posture, rolled down her window and glanced at my yard with a stern expression. I didn't think much of it at first. I had just finished trimming the bushes, and I was planning to spend the day working on the garden. It wasn't until I saw her pull out a clipboard from the passenger seat that I began to feel a twinge of unease. I waved at her. "Morning." She didn't wave back. Instead, she stared at me with a cool, scrutinizing gaze. It was as if she was examining me, not just my house or my lawn, but me personally. "You're Mr. Carter, aren't you?" she asked, her voice as sharp as the look in her eyes. I smiled, feeling the tension in her tone. "That's me. How can I help you?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the clipboard, flipping through a few papers before meeting my gaze again. "You're violating community standards, Mr. Carter. Your lawn isn't up to par. The grass is patchy, and the flower beds aren't properly maintained. This is a direct violation of the HOA's guidelines." I stood there momentarily stunned. It was true that my grass had a few bare spots, but I had been working on it. I had no idea it was a violation. My flower beds? Well, I had planted a few new things, but they were hardly overgrown or unsightly. In fact, the yard was far from a mess. It was just a little unpolished. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize the yard was an issue," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I've been doing some landscaping work, but I'll get to it. I'll have it fixed up this weekend. No problem." Cheryl didn't smile. "You've had plenty of time to fix it up, Mr. Carter. The notices have been sent. You just haven't been paying attention." Not paying attention? My mind raced. I'd been busy at work and trying to balance family life. The last thing on my mind was making sure the grass was perfectly green at all times. I hadn't received any notices, but I didn't want to argue right then. "Well, I'll make sure to address it," I said, trying to de-escalate. "Thank you for letting me know." She didn't take her eyes off me. "This is a serious issue, and unless you want to continue ignoring the rules, I'm issuing you a fine. $500 for the first violation." I blinked. "Wait, what? A fine? For my lawn?" "That's right. The HOA has rules, and you need to follow them if you want to be part of this community," she said almost coldly. "You'll get a formal letter in the mail with the details." My mind was spinning. I felt a pit in my stomach. A $500 fine for a few brown patches on the grass? It felt like an overreaction. "Cheryl, I'm happy to work on the lawn, but this seems a bit much, don't you think? A fine for something like this? She didn't budge. The HOA's rules are clear, Mr. Carter. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about maintaining property values. And if your property isn't up to standard, it brings everyone's value down. You wouldn't want your neighbors to suffer because of you, would you? I swallowed hard. I understood the concept of maintaining the community's value, but this was ridiculous. I'll take care of it, I promise. But is there any way we could discuss this a little more? I didn't even know about these specific rules. Her eyes narrowed. I'm not here to debate with you, Mr. Carter. The fine is issued, and that's final. I suggest you take it seriously. Her tone was final, cold, authoritative, unyielding, and something in the way she spoke, with an air of someone who had been in control for far too long, made me feel small. This wasn't just about a lawn. It was about power. Power over my home, my property, and my life. Before I could say another word, she rolled up her window and sped off, leaving me standing there in the driveway fuming. $500 for my lawn? It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anything in writing about these rules, and I certainly hadn't been told about the fines for something so trivial. I spent the rest of the day seething. I didn't want to make a scene, but I also didn't want to back down. I'd worked hard to get here, to make this house our home, and now some bureaucratic tyrant was trying to take that from me, over something as small as my yard. I decided to check the HOA guidelines. I combed through the papers I had received when we moved in. They were filled with jargon about lawn care, property maintenance, and community standards. But nowhere did I see anything specific about fines for minor landscaping issues. I found references to penalties for major infractions, like improper structural modifications or unapproved fences. But this, a lawn, it wasn't on the list. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Cheryl wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enforcing her power, her control, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. This wasn't just a fine anymore, it was a challenge, and I wasn't about to back down without a fight. I needed to understand what I was really dealing with, and more than that, I needed to find a way to take back control. The first fine had been the spark, but the real fire was just beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was finishing up a conference call at my desk. Lisa was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner, and the kids were playing in the living room. It was a normal day, but then the mail arrived. I noticed the envelope almost immediately. It was larger than usual, a heavy piece of paper and marked with the HOA's logo. My heart sank. I hadn't thought much of the previous fine, a petty $500 for my lawn. It had been absurd, sure, but I figured it was just an isolated incident, something that would blow over after a couple of phone calls. But this letter, it felt different. As soon as I held it in my hand, I knew something was wrong. I tore open the envelope with a sense of dread. As the paper slid out, my eyes locked on the words "Final Notice of Fine." My stomach tightened. I skimmed the text, expecting it to be another ridiculous charge. Maybe a fine for an incorrect fence height or a notice about our mailbox being too high. But what I read next made my vision blur for a second. $1,000. I blinked and reread the number. $1 million. My mind immediately went blank. My hands started to shake as I processed the words in front of me. Was this some kind of mistake? A typo? There had to be some explanation. This wasn't possible. I stood there in stunned silence. Lisa walked in just as I collapsed into the chair by my desk, holding the letter out in front of me. She glanced at it, her face suddenly drained of color. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head. "I don't know, but this can't be real." The letter outlined a supposed violation of the community aesthetics and code of conduct, citing a laundry list of infractions that I had never been notified about. Most of them seemed trivial, things like yard debris accumulation, failure to properly store recreational equipment, and violation of grass length specifications. But nowhere did it explain why these supposed issues were now worth. I tried to steady my breathing, but the anger was bubbling up. This was absurd. How could they possibly justify such a monstrous fine? The HOA had no right to pull something like this. "Sam," Lisa said, her voice trembling, "this has to be a mistake, right?" I shook my head again, my mind racing. "I don't know, but it doesn't feel like one. This feels like something personal. They're trying to break it." I felt the tension build in my chest. They had already fined me once over a patchy lawn, but this? $1 million? It was clear that Cheryl and the HOA weren't just about enforcing minor rules anymore. They were using their power to push me to the edge. They were trying to ruin me. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "No, I'm not letting them get away with this. I'm gonna fight back." Lisa's voice was soft but filled with concern. "How, Sam? $1 million fine? We don't have that kind of money. I know, I muttered, still pacing. But I don't think this is about the money. They want control, they want me to bow down. But I'm not going to. Lisa hesitated for a moment before walking over to me. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. What are you going to do? I stopped pacing and turned to face her. I need to figure out how to hit them where it hurts. If this is a fight they want, then I'll give it to them. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and started researching the HOA. I pulled up their website, the neighborhood guidelines, and all the documents I had from the day we bought the house. The more I read, the more infuriating it became. There was so much fine print, so many rules, but nothing about a fine of this magnitude. I started digging into the history of the HOA, trying to find anything that could give me leverage. It didn't take long for me to uncover some alarming information. Cheryl Davis had been the president of the HOA for nearly a decade, and in that time she had built a network of power that stretched far beyond the community. I found out that she had been involved in several questionable real estate deals, all tied to her personal interests. There were rumors of properties being devalued through fines and arbitrary rules, and residents being forced to sell their homes at a loss, only for Cheryl's network to snap them up. But what really struck me was the clubhouse. I remembered the building sitting at the heart of the neighborhood, the place where the HOA held its meetings, the spot where the community gathered for events. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but something about it felt off. I pulled up the deed for my property and started looking at the legalities. And that's when I found it. The clubhouse, which Cheryl and the HOA treated like their own personal property, was listed as part of my land deed. It wasn't on their property, it was on mine. I froze, my eyes wide with realization. This was it. This was the leverage I needed. I immediately started making calls. I spoke to a real estate lawyer I knew through a colleague, asking him to confirm what I had found. He explained that because the clubhouse was on my deed, I technically owned it. That gave me legal rights over it, and more importantly, it gave me the upper hand in the dispute with the HOA. The realization hit me hard. The $1 million fine wasn't just an attempt to punish me, it was a power grab. Cheryl and the HOA thought they could intimidate me into submission, but they had no idea what I had just uncovered. The clubhouse was on my land, and that meant I could use it against them. I couldn't let this opportunity slip by. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. This wasn't just about fixing my lawn anymore, it was about reclaiming control, and Cheryl Davis had no idea what she had just started. I sat there for hours, scrolling through property records, legal documents, and neighborhood reports. The sense of frustration and anger that had been bubbling inside me was slowly replaced by something colder: determination. I wasn't just going to fight back anymore, I was going to win. It was a normal search at first, just digging into the fine details of the neighborhood's property deeds, trying to figure out if there were any legal loopholes or weaknesses I could exploit. But then I stumbled onto something that made my heart race. The clubhouse, the very one that Cheryl and the HOA treated like their personal property, was listed on my deed. It wasn't a shared space, as they had always claimed. It wasn't even community property. It was mine. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend what I had just uncovered. It seemed too simple, too obvious, and yet it had been hiding in plain sight all this time. I pulled up the deed for my property again, checked it over, and zoomed in on the small print I had missed earlier. There it was, Parcel 7, Clubhouse and Grounds. It was clearly listed under my property, not the HOA. For a few seconds I could hardly breathe. This was the leverage I needed. The clubhouse was the heart of the HOA's operations, the place where they held their meetings, enforced their rules, and held power over the community, but it was sitting on my land. All their meetings, all their decisions were happening on my property, and that meant I had the right to control it. A rush of adrenaline flooded my veins. I wasn't just some helpless homeowner anymore. I was in a position of power. I had a weapon now, something the HOA didn't expect. Cheryl and her cronies had been so confident, so arrogant, that they never bothered to check their own property records. They never realized they were treading on my land. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization sink in. The $1,000 fine, it wasn't just an attack on my family. It was a power play. They wanted to break me, to make me feel helpless. But they had no idea they had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. Lisa came in just as I was sitting there staring at the screen, a faint grin creeping across my face. She stopped in the doorway, concerned. "Sam, what's going on?" I looked up at her, feeling a strange sense of calm. "I found something," I said, my voice steady. "Something that changes everything." Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What do you mean?" I stood up slowly, walking over to the counter where I had printed out the deed for our house. I placed it in front of her and pointed to the section that listed the clubhouse as part of our property. Her eyes widened as she read the word. That's the clubhouse, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But that doesn't make sense. The HOA has always run that place. I nodded slowly, a sense of power rising in me. It's mine. All of it. They've been using it, controlling it like it's their own. But it's actually on our land. That means they've been trespassing every time they hold a meeting there, every time they enforce rules. It's happening on my property. Lisa's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something else, something that mirrored my own growing confidence. So, you have leverage? You can do something about this? I smiled, the plan beginning to form in my mind. More than leverage. I can flip the script completely. They think they control this neighborhood, but they don't. I do. Lisa's eyes softened, but the concern was still there. Are you sure? $1 million fine, Sam. That's not something you can just ignore. What are you going to do? I paced for a moment, the adrenaline kicking in again. I hadn't felt this kind of focus in months. Not since the day we moved in. I'm gonna use their own rules against them. This fine, it's not about the money, it's about control. They want me to bow down and pay up, but what if I did it? What if I could turn the tables and make them pay for what they've done? I saw the light bulb flicker in Lisa's eyes. You're going to fight back, but this time you'll make them regret it. I nodded, my mind racing with possibilities. I'm not just going to fight them, I'm going to take control. I'll start by using the deed. I can evict them from the clubhouse. If I take that away from them, they lose their meeting place. Their authority disappears. Lisa frowned. But won't that make things even worse? They could get nasty, Sam. They might come after us harder. I stopped pacing and turned to face her, my eyes cold with resolve. I'm not afraid of them anymore. I've let them push me around for too long, but that ends now. I'm gonna fight them on their turf, legally, strategically, and I'll do it in a way they never saw coming. Over the next few days, I started building my case. I contacted my lawyer, who confirmed that I had a solid case for eviction. The clubhouse was technically mine, and the HOA had no legal right to use it, but I didn't want to just take it away. I wanted to use it to hit them where it hurt. I started digging into the HOA's finances, trying to find any discrepancies or legal vulnerabilities I could exploit. The more I uncovered, the more I realized just how corrupt Cheryl's little kingdom had become. There were unexplained expenses, questionable transfers of funds, and a pattern of fines and property acquisitions that seemed suspiciously favorable to her own real estate interests. I wasn't just going to fight this battle with legal paperwork. I was going to take Cheryl down from the inside out. I was going to expose her, strip away the power she'd built, and make sure she could never use the HOA to bully anyone again. I knew it wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and careful execution, but the tables had turned. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one in control. The revenge I had planned wouldn't be just about the fine. It would be about showing Cheryl and her cronies that no one could bully me in my own home. The battle had just begun, and I was ready. For the next few days, I threw myself into research. It wasn't just about the deed anymore. It was about strategy. I needed a way to outsmart Cheryl and her band of HOA bureaucrats. If I was going to take them down, I had to understand every legal loophole, every financial misstep they had made, every weakness in the system they'd built. I reached out to a few trusted contacts, lawyers, real estate experts, and even some local residents who had been through the HOA ringer themselves. I needed all the help I could get. The first person I called was my old friend from law school, Dave Miller. He had a reputation for handling property disputes, and I knew he'd be the best source of legal advice. We met at a coffee shop a few blocks from my house, and as soon as I explained my situation, he leaned forward with a serious look on his face. "Sam, this is going to get messy," Dave said, running his fingers through his hair. "The HOA's not going to back down quietly. Cheryl Davis has a lot of power, and she knows how to use it. But you're right, you've got something they don't expect: control over the clubhouse. That gives you leverage, but it also makes you a target." "I'm ready for that," I said, my voice firm. "But I need to know how to use that leverage legally. I want to start by evicting them from the clubhouse. If I can do that, I can shake their foundation." Dave nodded slowly. "It's doable. The key is to stay ahead of them legally. You can file for a formal eviction, but you'll need proof that the clubhouse is being used unlawfully. Cheryl's not going to give that up easily, so you'll need evidence, documents, photos, whatever you can get. You'll also need to prepare for retaliation." I felt a knot in my stomach. Retaliation wasn't just a vague threat, it was a very real possibility. Cheryl had a long history of making life difficult for residents who crossed her. I couldn't afford to let her see me coming. This had to be a quiet, calculated attack. "I'll get the evidence," I said, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over me. "What about the fine? The $1,000?" Dave raised an eyebrow. "You're still dealing with that fine?" I nodded. "Yeah, they're trying to break me financially, and it's not just about money, it's about power. They want to control me, my family, they want me to bend, and I won't." "Good," Dave said, giving me a rare smile. "You've got the right attitude, but here's the thing. You've got to hit them where it hurts. It's not just about fighting the fine, it's about exposing the truth. Start looking into their financials, you'd be surprised what you can find with a little digging." I spent the next week doing exactly that. Dave helped me pull public records for the HOA's finances. I went through them with a fine-tooth comb, looking for inconsistencies, wasteful spending, anything that could be used against them. What I found was nothing short of eye-opening. The HOA was spending an outrageous amount on community improvements, but most of it seemed to go into projects that were either unnecessary or clearly benefiting Cheryl and her friends. A new fence along the lake, for example, that was approved without any formal voting. It wasn't just a fence, it was a luxury project designed to improve the view from the HOA board members' homes. I also found that Cheryl had been pocketing a percentage of the funds allocated to maintenance, skimming off the top for personal gain. I had the evidence, now I needed to put it to use. But there was more work to do. I called in a few favors, speaking with several residents who had been harassed by Cheryl in the past. They shared their stories, how their lawns had been fined for minor infractions, how they had been bullied into selling their homes at a loss, how Cheryl had made their lives miserable. These weren't isolated incidents, this was a pattern of behavior. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how far Cheryl's reach went. She had a network of real estate agents and property managers under her thumb, buying up homes in the neighborhood at rock-bottom prices, all while using her position as HOA president to drive people out. She was a ruthless, power-hungry tyrant, and it was time for her reign to end. But there was a downside to all this progress. The more I fought back, the more Cheryl's retaliation grew. It started with small things, little fines for even the most trivial issues. One morning, I found a notice taped to my door. Violation mailbox height, with a fine of $5. The mailbox, it had been in the same spot since we moved in, and it was well within the HOA's approved specifications. I shook my head, crumpling the notice. Cheryl wasn't even pretending anymore. This wasn't about enforcing rules, it was about breaking me down. That evening, Lisa came home to find yet another notice. This one was for illegal vehicle storage, the kind of fine you get when you leave an old car in your driveway for too long. The only problem, the old car in question was my wife's minivan, which we had parked there while I was working on the garage. I threw the notice down on the counter, feeling the frustration boil up inside me. "This is it, Lisa. It's personal now. She's going to keep hitting us with fines, hoping we'll give up, but we can't." Lisa's expression was tense. "I know, Sam, but I can't help but worry. We've got the kids to think about. What if this escalates? What if she makes things worse?" I put my hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. "I'm not going to let her get away with this. We're not just fighting for our home, we're fighting for everyone she's hurt, and we're going to win." Despite the constant harassment, I kept pushing forward. I continued gathering evidence, filing complaints, and planning my next move. Every fine, every notice, only strengthened my resolve. Cheryl Davis had underestimated me, and it was time for her to find out just how big a mistake that had been. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a man with a plan, and it was only a matter of time before Cheryl's empire crumbled. The day of the meeting finally arrived. The HOA had called a special session, and Cheryl had made it clear that she expected all residents to attend. It was supposed to be a routine gathering, but I knew better. This was the moment I had been waiting for. A confrontation, a showdown. The pieces were in place, and now it was time to reveal my hand. I arrived at the community clubhouse early, well before the meeting began. I wanted to make sure I had everything ready, documents, evidence, and the confidence to stand my ground. I wasn't going to let Cheryl or anyone else walk all over me anymore. This was my home, my community, and I was done playing by their rules. The HOA board members started filtering in, chatting amongst themselves like nothing was wrong. Cheryl walked in last, as usual, with that smug look on her face, as though she was the queen of this little kingdom. She didn't even acknowledge me as I stood by the door, my arms crossed, my mind focused on the task at hand. When the meeting started, Cheryl stood up, took her place at the front, and began with the usual pleasantries. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. We have a few important matters to discuss, so let's get started. But I wasn't interested in her opening remarks. I stood up, interrupting her mid-sentence. Actually, Cheryl, before we start, there's something we need to address. A few heads turned in my direction. Cheryl's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Mr. Carter, if you have an issue, you can bring it up at the proper time. Please, sit down. I shook my head. No, Cheryl, this can't wait. I've been patient, but this has gone on long enough. The room fell silent. I could see the tension in Cheryl's eyes now. She wasn't expecting this. I'm sure you've all received my recent fines, I said, addressing the board. And I'm sure you're aware of the $1,000 fine I've been slapped with for alleged violations, but what none of you seem to realize is that I've been doing my homework, and I've discovered something you've all overlooked. Cheryl's eyes narrowed, but I didn't back down. I stepped forward, pulling out a stack of papers from my briefcase. This clubhouse you all cherish, the one you use for your meetings, your events, well, according to the property deed I hold in my hand, this building is not community property. It's on my land. It's part of my deed. The room erupted into murmurs. Cheryl's face turned an interesting shade of pale. That's absurd, she said, her voice laced with disbelief. You're mistaken. This is HOA property. I shook my head, holding up the deed for everyone to see. No, Cheryl, it's on my land. You've been using it without permission. You've been trespassing every time you've held a meeting here, and I'm tired of it. One of the board members, a man in his 60s, named Greg, stood up and scoffed. You don't have the right to come in here and make these kinds of accusations. This is a community matter, Carter. You can't just... I cut him off, my voice steady but firm. You're wrong, Greg. This isn't a community matter. This is a legal matter, and I'm here to tell you that I'm not backing down. I've already spoken to my lawyer. The eviction process is already underway. The HOA has no legal right to operate out of this building, not anymore. Cheryl stood up quickly, her face flushed with anger. You don't know what you're doing, Carter. You're making a huge mistake. You'll regret this. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice even. I don't think I will, Cheryl. You've tried to control me, my property, my life, but you've miscalculated. This isn't just about a fine, it's about power, and I'm taking mine back. There was a heavy silence in the room. The tension was palpable. I could feel Cheryl's anger radiating off her, but I stood firm, not giving an inch. We're not done yet, Cheryl, I said, my words cutting through the quiet. The battle has just begun. I have all the evidence I need. You can't intimidate me anymore. I could see the fear creeping into her eyes now, the realization that her control was slipping away. She opened her mouth to say something, but I raised a hand to silence her. I'll be sending over the official eviction notice, and I'll be notifying the residents about what's really going on. This neighborhood deserves better than you, and I intend to make sure they get it. Cheryl took a step back, her facade cracking for just a moment. You're making a mistake, she hissed. I didn't respond. I just turned around and walked out of the meeting room, leaving Cheryl and the rest of the board behind. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The final move was coming, and Cheryl Davis wasn't going to know what hit her. The day of the big reveal came faster than I expected. After the confrontation at the meeting, I knew it was only a matter of time before Cheryl and the HOA tried to retaliate. They would never back down without a fight, but I had something they didn't expect: control. I had the club. It was mine, and it was time to make that fact known. I called a special HOA meeting this time, one I was organizing. I didn't tell Cheryl or anyone else what the agenda was. I didn't need to. I already had everything in place. As the meeting started, I could feel the tension in the air. Cheryl walked in first, her usual confident stride faltering just a little when she saw the stack of papers sitting on the table in front of me. I had spent the last few days preparing legal documents, photographs, and a well-organized packet outlining everything I had uncovered. The moment I dropped that bomb on them, everything would change. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice calm and even, but with an undercurrent of something else, something they weren't prepared for. I know we've had some issues recently with fines, property violations, and, well, what you've decided to call community standards. But today, I'm here to talk about something far more important. Cheryl opened her mouth, probably to try and shut me down before I could get started, but I held up a hand. This meeting is about the truth, and I'm afraid the truth might be a bit harder for some of you to swallow. The room fell silent, board members exchanged uneasy glances, and Cheryl's lips tightened into a thin line. I could tell she was already steeling herself for whatever I was about to say. I've spent the last week digging into the HOA's records, I continued, slowly drawing out the suspense. And what I've found is something that changes everything. I've uncovered something none of you knew about, something that directly impacts your position here in this very clubhouse. I could see Cheryl's eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about, Carter?" she demanded, trying to maintain control. But I wasn't intimidated. I stood up slowly, my hands clasped in front of me, and turned to the projector screen at the front of the room. I clicked a button, and a high-resolution image of my property deed appeared on the screen, highlighting a key section: Parcel 7, Clubhouse and Ground. "The clubhouse that you all have used as your headquarters for years," I said, allowing the room to take in the document, "is not in fact community property. It's on my deed. It belongs to me." A collective gasp swept through the room. Cheryl's face paled, and the board members were frozen in shock. No one spoke, no one moved, but the realization was sinking in. I could feel their disbelief. They thought I was bluffing. They thought they could push me around and make me back down. I pulled out the original deed from my folder, slowly sliding it across the table to Cheryl. She reached for it reluctantly, eyes still wide with shock. As she read through it, her face twisted with confusion and then anger. The truth was undeniable, but Cheryl wasn't ready to accept it. She slammed the document back down on the table. "This is a mistake," she said, trying to recover her composure. "This has to be a mistake. You're misinterpreting the legalities. This doesn't change anything." I smiled, the calmness I felt surprising even me. "No, Cheryl, it's not a mistake. It's very clear. I own the clubhouse, not the HOA, not you, me." The room was dead silent now, everyone absorbing what had just happened. Cheryl opened her mouth, but the words were stuck. She couldn't argue this. She couldn't spin it to her advantage. This wasn't something she could sweep under the rug. "Now," I continued, "as for that $1 million fine you slapped me with, well, that's going to have to be reconsidered. In fact, I'd like to go ahead and cancel that fine, along with any other fines you've issued against me. Because, as it turns out, your authority over my property, well, it doesn't really exist anymore." Cheryl's eyes were wild now, her fists clenched. "You can't just do this. You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing." I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady. "Oh, I understand perfectly. The consequences are that you no longer hold power here. You've misused your position for too long, and it ends now." I looked around the room at the other board members, who were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them looked like they were waking up, realizing they had been complicit in Cheryl's reign of control. "I'm not just going to stop with the fine," I said, my voice firm. "Now, this clubhouse, it's mine, and I intend to use it to ensure that this community is run fairly. The HOA is going to be restructured, and Cheryl, you're going to step down. You've abused your power long enough." The shift in the room was palpable. The board members who had once been too afraid to speak up now shifted their weight in their seats, exchanging looks with one another. The power dynamics had completely shifted. Cheryl stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can't do this," she yelled, her voice shrill with panic. But I didn't flinch. "I already have," I said calmly. I turned to the rest of the board, making eye contact with each one. "I'm taking control now. This community deserves leadership that puts them first. I'll be sending out notices to the residents about the changes. And I'll be calling for a vote to elect a new board, one that actually serves the people." Cheryl's face twisted with anger, but she knew, deep down, that it was over. She had lost. The HOA had lost. And I had won. The immediate aftermath of the meeting was a whirlwind of chaos, but something felt different this time. The tension in the air was no longer directed at me. Cheryl and the HOA had lost. It was only a matter of time before they realized just how much they had underestimated me. The first signs of their desperation came the very next day. Cheryl called an emergency HOA board meeting, hoping to gather support and reverse the damage I had done. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The clubhouse, the heart of their operations, was no longer theirs to control. I had the deed, and I wasn't going to back down. I received a call from Cheryl not long after the meeting. She tried to remain calm, but I could hear the panic in her voice. "You think you've won, don't you, Carter?" she spat. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't just about the clubhouse. You're making a huge mistake." I kept my tone steady. "The only mistake I made was letting you think you could run things unchecked. This community deserves better, and I intend to make sure they get it." She tried to threaten me, but I wasn't intimidated anymore. She had no leverage. Her only move left was to attempt to appeal to the other board members, but they were already slipping away from her control. It was clear Cheryl wasn't as untouchable as she thought. The fallout came quickly. The other board members, once too afraid to stand up to Cheryl, began distancing themselves from her. Several started reaching out to me, quietly offering support and even apologizing for their previous inaction. Some of them had been complicit in her underhanded dealings, but they saw the writing on the wall now. They knew they couldn't keep supporting her, not when her reign was crumbling. Within a week, the first signs of a revolution emerged. One by one, longtime residents who had stayed silent began to speak up. They reached out to me, asking how they could help. Word spread quickly about the changes I was bringing to the neighborhood, and more people rallied behind me. I held a town hall meeting in the community clubhouse, the one I had reclaimed for us all. The room was packed, and for the first time since we moved here, it felt like the community was truly coming together. Neighbors who had once avoided one another now found common ground, united by a common enemy. People were angry, but they were also hopeful. The very same residents who had once feared Cheryl's wrath now saw me as a symbol of justice, someone who was willing to stand up for what was right. I had become the leader they never knew they needed. "Sam, we're with you," one of my neighbors, Tim, said, shaking my hand as he stood up to speak. "You showed us what real leadership looks like. Cheryl had been taking advantage of this community for too long. It's time we put things right." Others echoed his sentiments. "We've been living under her thumb for years," another neighbor added. "But you changed all that. We trust you, Sam." It was humbling. I had never intended to become the face of a movement, but here I was. It wasn't just about the clubhouse or the fine anymore. It was about restoring integrity to our community. The people who had once been passive observers were now active participants in rebuilding what had been broken. As the meeting continued, I watched the transformation unfold before my eyes. The sense of fear that had once hung over this place was beginning to dissipate. People were no longer afraid to speak up, to demand better for themselves and their families. The community had found its voice, and it was stronger than I ever could have imagined. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, I stood in the center of the room, taking it all in. The place that had once been a symbol of Cheryl's oppressive rule was now a space for hope and change. I could feel the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a privilege. I had helped lead this shift, and I knew I had to keep going. Later that night, I sat on the porch with Lisa, watching the sunset over the neighborhood. The kids were inside, doing their homework. For the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't heavy. There was a calm in the air, and it was something I hadn't felt in a long time. "I can't believe how far we've come," Lisa said, her voice soft as she leaned against me. "I remember when we first moved here, I thought it was the perfect place, but it was just a facade, wasn't it?" I nodded, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "It was. But we've broken that facade. It's not about Cheryl anymore, it's about us. The people who live here. The ones who have been silenced for too long." Lisa smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done something incredible, Sam. You didn't just fight for us, you fought for everyone, for the whole neighborhood." I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It wasn't just me, it was all of us. We've turned this place around, and now we have to keep going. We can't let what happened here be forgotten." As I looked out over the neighborhood, I realized just how much had changed, not just the physical space, but the people. Their attitudes, their willingness to stand up for what was right. We had all learned something over the past few months. We had learned that when we stand together, we're unstoppable. But there was more work to be done. The HOA was in shambles, Cheryl had lost everything, and the community was finally taking back control. The battle wasn't over, but it was clear that we were no longer fighting for survival. We were fighting for the future. The lessons I had learned were simple, but powerful. Never let anyone take away your voice. Never let anyone control your home, and never back down when you know you're right. The power had shifted, and this time it wasn't going anywhere. Weeks had passed since the town hall meeting, and the community was beginning to feel different. The transformation wasn't just about the removal of Cheryl and her corrupt leadership, it was about the air of empowerment that now hung over Hillside Manor. The board was restructured, the HOA dissolved in its previous form, and a new leadership emerged, one that truly represented the interests of the residents. The clubhouse, which had been the heart of Cheryl's oppressive rule, was now a space for meetings, community events, and local gatherings. There was no more tension in the air, no more whispering behind closed doors. The community was thriving, unified by the knowledge that we had reclaimed our power. People were happier, more involved, and most importantly, free from the constant fear that the HOA would come knocking with another ridiculous fine or violation. For me, the shift was profound. I was no longer just a resident. I had become a symbol, a leader not by choice, but by necessity. The role didn't come with a title, and I never wanted one. But I understood now that leadership isn't about titles, it's about action. It's about standing up when everyone else is afraid to do so. It's about taking a stand for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. I spent more time with Lisa and the kids, finally able to enjoy the peace we'd been looking for when we first moved here. The stress that had plagued our home was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. I had fought not just for my family but for everyone who had been bullied and manipulated by an out-of-touch system, and now there was peace. But the final twist was yet to come. The local news station picked up on the story of the HOA's fall from grace, and soon what had started as a quiet personal victory became a public triumph. The community's transformation was recognized, not just as a victory for the residents, but as a wake-up call for other neighborhoods plagued by similar problems. Cheryl Davis, once the unchallenged leader of the HOA, was publicly humiliated. She tried to hold on to whatever power she had left, but it was too late. Word had spread about her corrupt practices, her manipulation of property values, and her abuse of power. Her real estate business, built on the backs of residents who were forced to sell at a loss, was exposed. The financial discrepancies she had hidden for years were now out in the open, and the press didn't let her off the hook. Within weeks, Cheryl was forced to sell her business and leave the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her reputation was destroyed, and the community was better for it. For the first time, Cheryl Davis wasn't in control. I was. The moral of it all was clear. Stand up to bullies. Whether it's a neighbor, a system, or an institution, don't let them control you. Knowledge is power, and when you have the truth on your side, there is no limit to what you can achieve. The only thing that stands between you and victory is your willingness to fight for it. As I sat on my front porch that evening, watching the sunset over the lake, I realized how far we had come. Hillside Manor had been a place of fear, but now it was a place of community, of unity, of power reclaimed. And I, Sam Carter, had been part of the catalyst for that change. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. This was our victory. Our community's triumph, and it wasn't going anywhere. Life after the conflict felt like a quiet rebirth. The chaos, the stress, the constant battle with the HOA, it all seemed like a distant memory now. The dust had settled, and in its place, a renewed sense of peace had taken root in Hillside Manor. Lisa and I spent more time together, truly enjoying the home we had worked so hard for. The kids were thriving. Megan was more confident, no longer coming home with the weight of the world on her shoulders from the gossip that used to swirl around us. James had finally started to make friends, no longer feeling the tension that had once permeated our home life. They could finally relax, be kids, and enjoy their childhood without the looming threat of the HOA casting a shadow over everything. I didn't just notice the change in our home. The neighborhood itself was a different place now. The lawns, the streets, the community areas, everything looked the same, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. People smiled at one another again. Neighbors waved from their front porches, stopping to chat with each other, something that had become rare under Cheryl's rule. Block parties were organized with ease, no longer hindered by the threat of some arbitrary fine for too much noise. The oppressive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a sense of collective freedom and camaraderie. I spent my days as I had always intended to, working from home, going on walks with Lisa, and even sitting down to read books I'd never had the time to get through before. There was a calm I had never experienced in this neighborhood before, and it felt good to finally exhale. But the most rewarding part of all of this wasn't just the quiet victory I had won for myself and my family. It was the way the community had come together. Neighbors who once kept to themselves were now engaged, attending meetings, sharing their voices, and most importantly, working together to ensure this kind of thing could never happen again. We had formed a new HOA, one that was transparent, accountable, and above all, rooted in fairness. Every resident had a say. Decisions were made together. It was a far cry from the shadowy, authoritarian group that had once run things with an iron fist. As for me, I wasn't looking for recognition or a place in the spotlight. I'd done what I had to do. I stood up for what was right, and that was enough. But seeing the smiles on my neighbors' faces, hearing the relief in their voices as they talked about the changes, made me proud that we had turned the tide together. There were moments, of course, when I thought back to the beginning of this journey, the times I doubted myself, the sleepless nights wondering if I could truly overcome the power Cheryl had. But with every challenge, with every setback, I had learned something valuable. Justice wasn't something that just happened. It wasn't handed to you by a judge or a lawmaker. It was something you had to fight for. Sometimes it came with a heavy price, and sometimes it took longer than you thought. But when it arrived, it was worth every second. Looking out over the lake now, I could see the changes in the community, but I also saw the changes within myself. I had fought not just for my family or my home, but for something bigger, something more meaningful. The lesson was clear. When you stand up against what's wrong, the world begins to change in ways you never expected. And as I sat on the porch with Lisa, watching the sun set over the water, I knew that the battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. And for the first time in a long while, I could finally rest, knowing we had made a difference.